Settle in as we journey back to a time when choices were scarce and the human spirit found extraordinary ways to adapt.
You are not yourself today. You are someone else. A woman in the market square of a Yorkshire town in early spring of 1830. The cobblestones beneath your feet remain glazed with morning frost, and smoke clings low to the earth, mingling with the scents of hay, livestock, and sweat. Around your neck, a coarse brown damp rope is tied tightly like a halter. Your husband holds the other end, determined, but not angry or drunk, as he raises his voice above the murmuring crowd. "What am I bid for this fine woman?" he calls out, and your stomach twists with a jagged, cold sensation that is not just fear, nor shame, nor even grief, but surprisingly, hope. This desperate, humiliating ceremony might just be the only way out for you.
It is tempting to laugh at history when its rituals appear absurd, from powdered wigs to trial by water. Yet we often chuckle from a distance, believing we know better. But how many rituals in our own time exist only because the system has failed to provide a real answer? The Victorian practice of wife-selling was precisely one such ritual, persisting for nearly 2 centuries in a legally developed country. To understand why it happened, and why it was sometimes embraced by the very women it humiliated, we must step into a different world. This is not a world of savages or villains, but one of logic so warped that its participants believed they were doing what was necessary, moral, and even kind. It is a necessary journey, for it reveals what occurs when law, economy, and morality collapse upon each other, leaving ordinary people to confront the wreckage. In 1753, Sir William Blackstone, a towering figure in English legal history, articulated the doctrine of coverture, which became the cornerstone of British marital law for over a century. This meant that, by marriage, a woman's very legal existence was suspended, or entirely subsumed by her husband, under whose protection and cover she performed everything. She became a femme couverte, a covered woman, losing her individual identity, property, and agency in the eyes of the law. Before marriage, a woman could own land, sign contracts, and even sue, but after, her wages, inheritance, and children legally belonged to her husband. Her body was his right, and her life his burden, or not, leaving her with no legal recourse, even in cases of abuse, financial ruin, or abandonment. For the working class, divorce was an unattainable fantasy, with death often being the only relief.
Before the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, a full divorce in England required an expensive private Act of Parliament, costing around £1,000, which translates to over £100,000 today. Even after 1857, the cost remained prohibitive, far exceeding most labourers' annual earnings. In this legal vacuum, people improvised, leading to the emergence of one of modern history's most disturbing legal fictions, the sale of a wife. This practice was not satire or symbolic. It was a stark reality that began in the late 1600s, likely stemming from folk tradition and economic despair. It took firm root and flourished throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in the rural and industrial regions of northern England, becoming a desperate solution where no legal one existed.
At first glance, the wife sale resembled a livestock auction, a resemblance that was entirely intentional.
The husband would often advertise in a local paper, then lead his wife to the market square, typically with a halter around her neck, arm or waist, a rope for the poor, a ribbon for those feigning dignity. A crowd would gather, bids would be placed, and sometimes the wife would go to the highest bidder, though often the buyer was prearranged, perhaps a lover. Occasionally, the wife herself would even demand the sale. Regardless, there was always a public transaction, always witnessed and always regarded by at least some as binding, a grotesque parody of divorce, a vulgar shadow of consent. Yet it was, for many, the only option left, and to truly understand this necessary ritual, we must now look closely at the woman wearing the halter, for she is not abstract. She has a name, a voice, a past, and a painfully uncertain future. For our story, her name is Sarah.
She is 28 years old, with hands rough from scrubbing and arms tired from lifting. Her dress is faded blue, mended in 5 places. She has 3 children, 2 living. Her husband is named Robert, a bricklayer, whose wages are erratic, whose temper is not. Sarah married at 17. By 25, she had learned that love, if it existed, was a luxury for people with fewer mouths to feed. She met Thomas Miller, a widower, one Sunday at the wash-house. He listened. He offered her a slice of meat once when he saw her fingers trembling. He never touched her, never said a word out of place, but he offered something rarer than food or comfort. He offered a question. What would you do if you could leave? Sarah didn't answer with words. She asked her husband for a sale.
The market square is full this morning with sellers, curious onlookers, and children, as Sarah stands on a wooden box, the halter still around her neck. Robert calls out the opening bid, and the crowd responds slowly, offering low, mocking amounts. Then Thomas Miller steps forward, stating 3 shillings, a pre-arranged signal rather than a romantic gesture, causing Sarah's lips to tighten in recognition. However, a young, nervous farmer unexpectedly raises his hand, bidding 4, much to Thomas's visible dismay and Robert's greedy grin. Robert prods for more, and the young man quickly offers 5, leaving Thomas to hesitate, looking at Sarah, who deliberately looks away.
Then, in a voice louder than any man's in the square, Sarah declares, "I choose Thomas Miller." The square falls silent, for this is not how this ritual is supposed to work. Yet no one moves, acknowledging something sacred about choice, even when made from a scaffold with a rope around one's neck. Sarah's story, like many others, ends not in triumph, but in profound ambiguity. Perhaps Thomas is kind, or perhaps he drinks. Perhaps Sarah finds a new life, or perhaps she has merely changed the name of her master. This is no fairy tale, but a testament to people improvising justice in a world where the law offered none, revealing that the wife's sale was not just a scandal, but a terrifying survival mechanism. When systems fail, people do not collapse. They create, even if what they create is cruel, shameful, or barely human, even if it means putting a rope around your own neck because it is the only way to breathe.
The transaction is now complete, the rope transferred, and the satisfied crowd begins to disperse.
as Sarah and Thomas disappear down a side street heading into an unrecorded future. Yet an unspoken question lingers above the emptying square, like smoke from a market fire. Why did this grotesque ceremony, conducted in broad daylight and witnessed by hundreds, function in a country priding itself on legal sophistication? The paradox lies in its illegality, for wife-selling had no standing in formal British legal code, at best a folksy contract, at worst a public charade basking adultery and bigamy. Courts did not recognize it, Parliament did not endorse it, yet magistrates stood by. Newspapers printed announcements, clergy often looked away, and communities accepted the outcome as binding. This was because the actual law, cold, patriarchal, and unyielding, offered no relief, compelling people to craft their own rituals, transfer documents, and courts of conscience played out amidst smoke, hay, and shouted bids. Sometimes participants in wife-selling even drew up bills of sale, parodies of legal language handwritten in ink, reading like property transfers, such as, "I, John Parsons, for and in consideration of the sum of £6 and 6 shillings, do sell, assign, and set over unto John Tucker, Ann Parsons, my wife, with all rights, property, claim, and services during the term of her natural life." This grotesque practice was brilliant in its dark logic, with a halter serving as livery of seisin, the market square as witness, and the crowd as notary, together creating a makeshift courtroom that functioned precisely because official ones had failed. These were not private affairs. The crowd came not just to watch, but to validate, as community recognition became the only currency of legitimacy in a world where women had no legal identity and divorce was a fantasy. Public visibility was often the only protection a woman had, ensuring everyone knew who she belonged to.
In many cases, the sale had already been arranged in secret. The buyer, usually a lover or suitor, would attend, bid the agreed amount, and complete the transfer. The auction was theatre, designed to convince the community. In 1826, in Brighton, a man led his wife to the square and sold her to a sailor for £5. The papers noted that she seemed nothing loath to go, and the business was conducted with great good humour. But if the ritual was breached, if the wrong man bid, or if the woman objected, things could unravel quickly. In one case from Manchester in 1824, a woman sold for 5 shillings disliked the buyer and was resold immediately for 3 shillings and a quarter vail, demonstrating her communal, if not legal, agency. In the theatre of the wife sale, unwritten rules emerged. The woman should not be visibly coerced. The sale should be public. The halter must be transferred, payment witnessed, and the buyer acceptable to the crowd, for breaking these rules could turn the crowd.
In 1837, a blacksmith in Halifax sold his wife for a shilling, bought her back, then sold her again to a married man, leading to her finding him in a pub and beating him senseless, with the newspaper ironically noting her lack of consent. This anecdote reveals a deeply human need for order beneath the brutality of wife-selling, even amidst chaos. The price of a wife varied wildly, from a few shillings or a pint of ale to as high as £100, especially if children were included, as seen in an 1865 case where a woman and 2 children were sold for £100 plus £25 per child, equivalent to over £18,000 today. Yet the money was not the true point. The real value lay in the social recognition of the transaction, making it more theatre and ritual than economics. The halter itself held significant symbolic weight, humiliating yet necessary, creating a visible moment of transfer that even illiterate witnesses could understand, and in the square, a woman's posture, tone, silence, or defiance could speak volumes, sometimes saving her, sometimes not.
Imagine Mary Ann Price, a woman in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales, in 1837, amidst a collapsing economy, with a coal miner husband drinking away their shillings, sick children, and unpaid rent. She finds Lewis, a man who treats her gently and offers help, saying, "If I could take you away from this, I would." So, Mary Ann arranges for an agent to buy her on Lewis's behalf at the market. The auction proceeds smoothly, the rope is passed, and money changes hands, allowing Mary Ann to walk away not as a runaway, but as someone transferred. She was still a victim, yet also a strategist and a survivor, navigating a world that denied her every legal tool except the stage of a livestock market. The true horror of wife-selling is not its occurrence in shadows, but its acceptance in broad daylight for over 150 years, not because people were cruel, but because the alternatives were simply worse.
England was not alone in its desperation. Where law is silent, poverty is loud, and tradition festers in the gaps left by failed systems. Rituals emerge, some wearing the face of religion, some the mask of property, and some a halter. As we step across borders and languages, we ask, was wife-selling unique to Victorian England, or did other civilizations disguise the same scream differently? In China, during the late Qing dynasty, impoverished rural families often sold wives to repay debts or settle disputes, with marriage brokers mediating and contracts signed with fingerprints. Wives could be temporarily pawned and widows bought by clans to bear posthumous children for dead sons. What England enacted in a public square, China buried under Confucian euphemism. Yet the wound was the same, a woman reduced to currency.
In Edo period Japan, husbands could divorce their wives with a simple written note, the mikudari-han, offering more legal flexibility than England, yet only the husband could issue it. Upon divorce, a woman lost everything: children, income and status, often ending up in yukaku, licensed pleasure quarters in cities like Osaka and Edo, becoming a geisha or something else. Here, the law offered a shell of civility while society effectively swallowed her whole, mirroring the underlying vulnerability seen elsewhere. Meanwhile, in the United States, particularly in rural colonial settlements and frontier towns, wife-selling was rare but not entirely unknown. Colonial court records from Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and the Carolines document isolated cases of men transferring wives for livestock, cash, or labor debts, sometimes with bills of sale echoing English practices. However, due to deeper Puritan ethics, the shame was greater, so wife-selling often took other forms. Desertion became more common, with men simply vanishing, or women remarrying without legal clarity, risking bigamy. Communities sometimes accepted the fiction that the first husband had died, even when they knew otherwise, making the American version not a public ceremony, but a public secret.
In France, while wife sales were absent, there was a keen fascination with England's practice, with French newspapers printing lurid accounts and satirical cartoons depicting John Bull leading a woman on a leash. To the French, this was proof of English hypocrisy, a nation claiming moral superiority, yet selling its women like market beef. However, France too harbored its own hypocrisies. The Napoleonic Code made divorce nearly impossible for women to initiate, and while a woman caught in adultery faced jail, a man with a mistress received a mere shrug. The methods differed, yet the underlying message remained consistent. Woman as a liability, property, or a problem to be solved. As we scan the globe, we thus uncover not a singular wicked tradition in England, but a panorama of systemic failure painted in different dialects: the halter, the pawn contract, the ink-stamped divorce note, the vanished husband, or the daughter loaned for food. These are not mere customs, but compensations, makeshift answers people invent when real justice is unreachable. And when enough people invent the same answer, it becomes what we call tradition.
Let us now move closer, standing among the crowd, not as Sarah, the seller, or the buyer, but as the others who watched and remembered. In 1860, in a North Yorkshire village, a witness named Arthur Money recorded what he termed the fine old custom, observing an elderly man sell his considerably younger wife for 18 pence. Despite the buyer's uncertainty, the crowd assured him, "A fair deal, the halter makes it binding." However, later that night, the couple was burned in effigy on the village green because the buyer was married, revealing the community's support had limits and unwritten rules were enforced with fire and laughter.
Now imagine a 6-year-old child in that square, standing beside his chuckling father, watching the woman with the rope, her eyes darting between bidders as the numbers rise and the rope passes from hand to hand. He does not understand it yet, but later, when he sees his mother cry behind the curtain, witnesses the bruises on her shoulder, and hears the word divorce spoken in hushed tones, he will remember the auction. Years later, he might joke to a friend, "Why don't we just sell her?" Not because he believes it, but because trauma often returns wearing the mask of humor.
Wife-selling did not escape satire, with comic ballads emerging in mid-19th century music halls, depicting scenes like a husband selling his wife for 2 shillings and a mug of stout. Audiences roared, not out of approval, but because laughter made the unbearable survivable, as the poor often survive injustice through jokes. Behind every parody lies a truth too heavy to bear raw, a reality even the satirical songs acknowledged. There is something eerie about witnessing a community regulate a ritual the law refuses to touch, transforming the crowd into a judge. If a woman visibly resisted or screamed, the auction might be halted. If the husband sold her to an abuser, he might be pelted with fruit. And if the buyer failed to pay, the sale could be voided by public scorn. This was not chaos, but a parallel justice system, unwritten yet enforced by collective expectation. A form of rough justice where the market square served as the courtroom, the rope as the contract, and the laughter as the verdict, with the woman as both defendant and evidence. If this was so grotesque, so humiliating, why did it persist for over 150 years? Because for many women it worked. Not perfectly, honorably, or without pain, but it offered what no law did: a new life. The choice was never between being sold or freedom. It was between remaining in a house with a man who beat you, or staging a public humiliation and walking away with someone who might be kinder. It was not liberation, but it was the closest available simulation, and sometimes even a counterfeit freedom can keep someone alive. This leads to the uncomfortable question, why did so many people, men and women,
towns and parishes, clergy and commoners not only permit wife-selling, but participate in it? The answer is not that they were cruel, but that they were functioning within a system where cruelty had been normalized and disguised as necessity.
In an economy where most people earned barely enough to eat, where legal systems prioritized property over persons, and where poverty left no room for rebellion, practical morality took over. The husband thought, I can't afford to feed her, she wants to leave, someone else wants her, let's make it clean. The wife thought, if I run, I'll be a criminal, if I stay, I'll be a corpse, if I'm sold, I might survive. The crowd thought, if we don't witness this, who will say she belongs to the new man? Who will protect her from being dragged back? Better we watch and pretend it's funny. This is how societies adapt to failure, not with law books, but with performance.
Wife-selling began to decline in the 1840s, not because society suddenly became enlightened, but because it became embarrassed. Newspapers, increasingly read by a growing middle class, began calling the practice barbaric, disgusting, and a stain on the empire. The rising bourgeoisie, obsessed with domestic privacy and moral cleanliness, could not tolerate such public spectacles of marital collapse, especially among the poor. Suddenly, prosecutions began to occur, not frequently but symbolically. Men who sold wives faced jail time. Buyers were sometimes charged with conspiracy to commit adultery, and in rare cases, couples were arrested for causing a public disturbance. But the practice didn't vanish overnight. It went indoors, becoming increasingly private in the 1850s and 60s, arranged in taverns, witnessed by just a few, and recorded quietly. The halter disappeared. The auctioneer vanished, but the transaction, the idea, persisted, because the law still hadn't changed, only its image had.
Religious groups began to campaign against wife-selling, with the Salvation Army, Methodist preachers, Baptists, and Reform clubs distributing pamphlets proclaiming, God joins man and wife, no auction can undo it, and sisters in bondage, take up the gospel. Yet here lies the strange irony. Even among reformers, the desperation that birthed wife-selling was understood. In 1889, a member of the Salvation Army himself sold his wife for a shilling in Nottinghamshire, claiming he had prayed for guidance and believed the buyer, a widower, was chosen by Providence. He simply stated, I loved her, but I could not feed her, illustrating that even the righteous sometimes bowed to the economics of failure.
Let us return now, one last time, to Sarah. The rope is gone, the crowd has dispersed, and Thomas Miller leads her down a quiet lane, past stalls of bread and hay, toward a life they have not yet imagined. Perhaps he is kind, perhaps he drinks, perhaps Sarah finds peace, or perhaps she learns that changing masters is not the same as becoming free. Because even though the rope is off, its mark remains in lore, in memory, in the gaze of the crowds that saw her body traded. She has no legal identity. She cannot inherit, testify, or keep the coins she earns. She has simply been transferred, not liberated. But she chose the man, and in a world where choice was almost a myth, that act, however small or staged, may be the closest thing to power she will ever hold.
Wife-selling is officially gone, with the last recorded case in England occurring in 1913 in Leeds, where a woman testified her husband had sold her to a workmate for £1,
without a crowd or halter. Yet the idea lived on in jokes, music hall parodies, and rural memory, and in other forms. We no longer sell wives, but we still witness marriages of economic desperation. A woman marries for a visa, a man finds a mail-order bride, or a domestic worker trades herself into servitude abroad under the legal nanny. No halter, no shillings, but the brutal, buried logic persists. You cannot leave unless someone else claims you, and even then you are not free. You are simply theirs.
The horror of wife-selling was not the act itself, but the fact that it had to be invented by the poor, the trapped and the forgotten, to compensate for a legal system that refused to see women as people. When a woman became a wife, she ceased to exist, so she had to be sold to exist again in someone else's eyes. Even the community, which sometimes protected her, never saw her as equal, only as better or worse than the last man who claimed her. Wife-selling is history, but what it reveals is timeless. What happens when the law doesn't protect the vulnerable? What rituals do we invent and accept to survive the impossible? What price do we pay, not just in flesh, but in dignity, to make unbearable systems tolerable? And above all, what would you do if the only way to escape was to be sold? Would you tighten the rope yourself? Would you smile for the crowd? Would you call it justice because it was the only kind available?
The market squares are now shopping centres. The wooden boxes gone, the halters turn to handbags, and the auctions algorithms. And yet there are still women standing in silent crowds, waiting to be claimed, and systems that ask the vulnerable to perform humiliation in exchange for protection. There are still rituals, quieter, slicker, that pretend to be freedom. We have replaced the rope with paperwork, the shillings with signatures, the crowd with a camera, but the burden remains. And so do the scars. To remember the women of the wife markets is not just to study history, it is to understand how easily people, good people, desperate people, can build customs out of cruelty when no other options exist. They were not fools or savages. They were survivors. And they deserve more than mockery. They deserve memory.
As the echoes of these stories fade, may you find peace in the quiet moments and drift into a restful sleep.